best policy on Iraq. The hearing by a House Appropriations Subcommittee is just under 2.5 hours.
Captain's new backlog. She was here. Martin, you were on the subcommittee. The Subcommittee on Foreign Operations, Export Financing and Related Programs will come to order. Mr. Secretary, it's my pleasure to welcome you here this morning. Before I do, let me also welcome our new members who are here. I should say new and old members returning. Ms. Kaptur has been on this subcommittee before, and we welcome her back to this.
Mr. Chairman, if I could ask the gentleman to yield, I hope you don't say old, but former.
Former member, thank you. Thank you. I stand corrected.
Right.
Definitely.
Correct.
I don't know.
And new members that are on the subcommittee for the first time and on the full committee for the first time include Mr. Kirk. At the end there, we also have Mr. Vitter and Mr. Crenshaw, who I believe will be with us here shortly. So we welcome them as members of this subcommittee. Mr. Secretary, your country and certainly this committee holds you in very high esteem as the primary foreign policy advisor to the President in what I think are clearly very challenging times. I know that all the members are very anxious to ask questions and exchange views with you, so I'm going to make my remarks brief. The topic of today's hearing is the fiscal year 2004 budget, but with a showdown looming with Iraq and a costly supplemental expected, I have to say that it's not always easy to focus on the 2004 budget, but I'm going to try anyhow. The President's request for fiscal year 2004 is $18.8 billion. That's a 15% increase over last year. Mr. Secretary, this is bold. It's an ambitious request. And as one who has consistently argued that we must see our foreign assistance budget as part of a national security, a larger national security strategy, I applaud you. But I do have many questions about the details. And in the end, of course, it will be the details that will determine the levels this subcommittee recommends to the committee and the committee recommends to the House. But I have to say that we will need vigorous support by the President if we're going to see this increase materialize at the end of the appropriations cycle. It will be difficult to secure the requested increase unless our members are shown effective executive branch management of international programs. The budget contains 3 new presidential initiatives, all of which raise management concerns. There's a $100 million request for a complex contingency fund, a $200 million request for a famine fund, and there's a $450 million request for an emergency plan for AIDS relief. I confess that I find myself a bit perplexed as to which agency is going to administer the funds for each of these and who will be answerable to this committee in regards to its implementation. Consider for a moment the proposed $450 million emergency plan for AIDS relief. It is still unclear what role the President contemplates for USAID, for the State Department, and for the Department of Health and Human Services in implementing the implementation of this third initiative that deals with AIDS. The funds for complex emergencies and famine relief would be under the President's direct control. Hence, they will largely be managed by the Office of Management and Budget, which raises some real concerns for us since they are outside our reach to talk to and to have them testify before us. The Millennium Challenge account, the multi-billion-dollar proposal first unveiled a year ago, provides another case in point that raises organizational questions. The President requested a new Millennium Challenge corporation that would reside outside of both the State Department and USAID. Let me be clear, I support this initiative. I was very enthusiastic to be with the President in Monterrey, Mexico, when he announced the 50% increase in development assistance, and I'm a very strong supporter. In fact, I wanted to include a pilot program in the 2003 omnibus bill. Unfortunately, we didn't have the details worked out at that time to make it possible for the administration to have an implementation and marketing strategy for this program. Mr. Secretary, your role, as well as the role of USAID and the Department of Treasury, is not clear in all of these initiatives. I don't understand why the Secretary of Treasury would be on the board of this new MCA corporation, but not the administrator of USAID. Maybe the tone in my voice reflects some anxiety about the future of foreign aid without USAID and the State Department at the center. But it presents a challenge for you and Administrator Natsios to convince the President that your agencies can do the job, that your officials can live up to his vision of effective delivery of foreign assistance. The very fact that I express this anxiety suggests that I have that confidence in you, and I know that the President does as well. Let me be very blunt. To my thinking, many of these initiatives appear to challenge the primacy of the Secretary of State as the President's primary advisor and Chief Executive Officer for Foreign Affairs. At a time when the respective roles for the Department of State and USAID are undefined and often overlapping, a vacuum has emerged that encourages the Executive Office of the President and domestic cabinet agencies, such as Departments of Health and Human Services and the Treasury, to seize important roles in managing international assistance program. Perhaps U.S. national security and foreign policy challenges are so great that some of this mission creep is inevitable. Finally, let me turn to Iraq. The committee has not been consulted in depth about the overall requirements for Iraq between now and the enactment of the promised supplemental. We're aware that 2003 funds that were appropriated for other programs are in the process of being reprogrammed. But that approach won't be sufficient to meet the likely requirements for reconstruction and relief that will be needed during the next several months. This cavalier approach to Congress by the Executive Office of the President follows a pattern we encountered while seeking to identify funding requirements for Afghanistan. I want to make it clear, as I did just a moment ago, Mr. Secretary, my remarks are not aimed at the Department of State. I not only have great confidence in you, but I want to personally thank you and Deputy Secretary Armitage, Assistant Secretary Paul Kelly, for your efforts to keep the committee fully informed. Your team, frankly, I think could serve as a model for superb executive-legislative branch relations. I am going to do something just a little bit out of the ordinary at this point. Before I turn to the ranking member for her statements and for the other opening statements, I'm going to exercise my prerogative as chairman to address one issue that I think deserves special attention today, and that is the co-relationship between the issues of Iraq and Israel. Recently, the discussion of our policy in Iraq has included considerable speculation about the extent to which the State of Israel and its American supporters drive that policy. Last week, columnist Robert Novak questioned the wisdom of our policy because, in his view, many current members of the Bush administration have in the past publicly linked the removal of Saddam Hussein with support for Israel. Yesterday, the Washington Post published an editorial entitled "Blaming the Jews" that stated it wouldn't necessarily be anti-Semitic, just demonstrably wrong, to argue that Mr. Bush's Iraq policy is motivated primarily by a desire to protect Israel. I'm hesitant to raise this issue, but I think it's a timely opportunity for you as Secretary of State and the Chief Foreign Policy Spokesman for the United States to remind all of us of the actual origins of our Iraq policy. You can help end any speculation that our policy was developed and is being pushed by some kind of conspiratorial manner by supporters of whether it's Israel, Saudi Arabia, or any other group, nation or group, ethnic or otherwise, that attempts to influence the workings of our government. And so before I proceed to the other opening statements, I'd like you to respond to that last point, if you would, Mr. Secretary.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'm very pleased to be here with you, and let me respond to that last point. U.S. policy with respect to Iraq is not just something that has been developed in the last month or so. One can go back many years to the end of the Gulf War, and when that war ended, resolutions were passed that said Iraq should disarm itself of its weapons of mass destruction. And you well know the history of the last 12 years of continued Iraqi defiance of their obligations under those resolutions, a total of some 16 resolutions, and finally 1441 was passed by the United Nations, where the whole international community came together. Arab nations, European nations, and nations in this hemisphere came together and said Iraq must be disarmed, and it has been U.S. policy for many years that Iraq should be disarmed. In 1998, when there seemed to be no progress toward the disarmament of Iraq, the administration at that time put in place what was called regime change policy, which seemed to be the only way to get this regime to disarm, was to change the regime itself. And that policy was also put in place by the United States Congress, which in legislation passed in 1998 supported efforts as may be necessary to get a change in the regime. This administration came in, the President examined very carefully our policy with respect to all the nations of concern to us, whether it was Iraq, Iran, North Korea, other nations, and he continued the policy of regime change, not expecting that there was any other way to disarm Iraq. But the President took one last chance for peace, and that's when he went to the United Nations to see whether or not this regime would change itself in the presence of 1441 and massive international political pressure, as well as the buildup of military forces to support diplomacy or to militarily change the regime. This is a policy that was developed over 2 administrations, over many years, and it remains our policy today. It is driven by our own national interests. It is driven by us trying to help the United Nations do its job. It is driven by our concern for the people of Iraq. Of course, we have a concern for the state of Israel. We have been one of Israel's strongest supporters, if not its strongest supporters, for many years, 50 years, and we will continue to do so. But we have other friends in the region as well. All across that part of the world, we have close alliances, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Egypt. These are nations that have been friends of ours for many years. We also have a commitment to trying to help the people in the occupied territories to create a Palestinian state, and President Bush is committed to that. So we have a comprehensive policy for the region, and our region, the strategy with respect to Iraq has derived from our interest in the region and our support of UN resolutions over time. It is not driven by any small cabal that is buried away somewhere that is telling President Bush or me or Vice President Cheney or Condi Rice or other members of our administration what our policies should be. I would also point out that this past fall, the Congress of the United States passed another resolution supporting the President's efforts to cause Saddam Hussein to come into compliance. And the joint resolution passed by the Congress said we should do it through the UN, and if that doesn't succeed, then we should be prepared to use United States Armed Forces in a willing coalition. So this is not just the result of a few individuals who are running loose, as some suggest, but it's a comprehensive policy developed over the years, over several administrations, with the support of the United States Congress, as reflected in last fall's joint resolution and the action the Congress took in 1998.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I think it's important to have that response on the record. Ms. Loy, I'll turn to you for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Secretary Powell. I know you are extremely busy with other national security matters, and please be assured that we are especially grateful that you have taken time to be with us today. And I personally want to tell you how much I appreciate, and I know the Chairman does as well, your continuous briefings that you and Deputy Armitage provide, and I thank you very much. I intend to take a few minutes as we open this hearing to express some concerns I have not only about world events, but also about the FY 2004 request. Anticipating that we are about to commence a campaign to disarm Iraq and bring about a regime change, I would first commend you, Mr. Secretary, for your continued efforts to secure the support of our allies in this endeavor. As you may know, I supported the congressional resolution on Iraq last fall, and I continue to support efforts to disarm Saddam Hussein. However, I do have several concerns. I am most concerned about the manner in which the United States has approached the UN and our allies during the diplomatic process of determining how best to disarm Iraq. Constant public declarations from the highest-ranking administration officials that what our allies believe and what the UN does have no bearing on U.S. policy have, in my judgment, eroded our legitimacy as an honest participant in global diplomacy. I believe we have approached this process cloaked in hubris rather than humility, refusing to adequately and patiently justify the legitimate need for action to the international community. Whether we go to war or not, and even now I sincerely hope we do not, I believe it will take years to rebuild our relationships with many of our major allies and our stature in the global community. I'm not saying that it is fair or that our actions justify such loss of standing. But the simple fact is that it appears to me it is just happening, and it could curtail our ability to achieve a wide array of foreign policy and international development goals as time goes on. Turning to the budget, I commend the administration for including significant increases in the FY 2004 budget request for foreign assistance. It is gratifying that there finally seems to be broad recognition of the strategic importance of foreign aid. Unfortunately, however, if you look beneath the surface of this request, you will find that virtually the entire $2 billion increase has gone into new initiatives, which are to be administered by new entities tasked with taking the corporate approach to problem solving. This new framework results from a push to package new funding in the context of presidential initiatives rather than reforming and improving the delivery of aid through the Agency for International Development. This demonstrates, for me, a high degree of dysfunction and dislocation within the administration's overall foreign aid strategy, and I fear it will adversely affect the good work we do around the world. Virtually the entire $2 billion increase above the FY 2003 level is devoted either to the Millennium Challenge Account, the HIV/AIDS Initiative, the Complex Emergency Fund, or the Famine Fund. The primary accounts, providing for other health, education, child survival, environment, trade capacity building, agriculture, and democracy programs, have either been straight-lined or cut from last year. This translates into cut in country-level funding in most of the countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, again with the exception of HIV programs. OMB made a unilateral decision that our aid programs in Russia and Ukraine should be shut down within 2 years and have cut USAID's programs there almost in half in 2004. The uncertainty surrounding Iraq reconstruction, for which $150 million has already been borrowed from 2003 resources, also threatens to disrupt ongoing assistance programs. With respect to the Millennium Challenge Account and the HIV/AIDS strategy, I do applaud their broad purposes and welcome the new resources being allocated for these initiatives. However, the proposal to create a new corporation in the case of the MCA and a new State Department coordinator in the case of HIV/AIDS initiative will needlessly delay and complicate the process of reaching people in need. I'm not convinced that the corporate approach or the use of the venture capital model with either the MCA or the HIV/AIDS initiative will lead to more effective programs. While I do not question the motives of those who have adopted this conceptual approach, I do question their range of experience in actual program implementation. The assumption on their part that innovative solutions to perennial development challenges will emerge magically from this top-down approach is simply, in my judgment, wrong and hopelessly naive. The creation of a new HIV coordinator with all the attendant bureaucratic and policy shifts will needlessly slow implementation of badly needed HIV programs and is completely unnecessary in light of the excellent resources already available within the U.S. government. Again, I never hesitate to say we should improve these programs, make them better, make them more efficient, change them around, but to delay to create a whole new process is really questionable in my judgment. We thus find ourselves in a position of confronting cuts to many country programs in 2004 while devoting resources instead to presidential initiatives, the structure and potential impact of which remain unclear. Moreover, the budget request reveals a cavalier attitude on the part of many administration officials who are willing to sacrifice progress in developing countries to make way for these untested presidential initiatives. USAID, meanwhile, has been left out of the strategic planning loop in a position of uncertainty. So at a time when we should hail increased resources for foreign aid, we instead must focus on proposed cuts in existing programs and unnecessary delays with new resources while new top-heavy bureaucracies are created. I do hope, Mr. Secretary, Congress will intervene to save the administration from itself and will recommend changes to the request that will maximize the effectiveness of ongoing aid programs. I also should add that there are some bright spots, particularly the administration's willingness to re-examine our assistance programs in the Middle East in response to the war on terrorism, and I am confident that Congress will find ways to spend the additional requested resources wisely and efficiently. We just don't need, in my judgment, to reinvent the wheel to do so. Finally, I have some final thoughts which I hope to expand upon during the question and answer period. Despite a clear mandate from Congress, the administration has cut funds for basic education, which frankly, Mr. Secretary, simply confounds me. The administration has also signaled its intention to expand the reach of the Mexico City policy to HIV/AIDS funding and possibly to assistance dispersed through the State Department, a move which could severely damage foreign aid programs. There is nothing in the requests which would help countries on the cusp of qualifying for MCA funds to solve the health and education sector problems that have caused them to miss the mark. And finally, Mr. Secretary, as we plunge into the Iraq conflict, we take on the huge task of reconstruction, which will cost in the tens of billions of dollars, with no prospect for any significant help from our allies. I sincerely hope the institutional commitment exists to take on this effort ourselves, as it appears we have to do. Thank you again, Mr. Secretary. I look forward to a productive exchange of views.
Thank you, Ms. Lowy. Chairman Young?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I don't have an opening statement, but I would like to open two subjects if this is an appropriate time.
Certainly. Do you want to do it? Would you like me to call on you first after the Secretary's opening statement?
I think that would be appropriate.
Mr. Secretary.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Congressman Lowy, for your opening remarks, and thank you for your compliments with respect to how we have been trying to run the department and the level of cooperation we have achieved between the department and the Congress. We do work hard at this. Assistant Secretary Kelly, all of my budget people, and especially my deputy, Rich Armitage, view this as one of our principal responsibilities to be good stewards of the taxpayers' money, and you are also stewards of the taxpayers' money, and we owe you our best answers and all the information you need to do your job so that you can support us in doing our job. And I view that as something we have done successfully over the last 2 years, to include opening up the new office that we have up here in Capitol Hill to serve you better with respect to your needs from the State Department. And I thank you for your support. Mr. Chairman, I do have a prepared statement for the record, which I would like to submit.
The entire statement will be put in the record.
And I would like to shorten that statement, and then after going through my shortened statement, I'll deal with the specific questions that have been raised by you, sir, and by Ms. Lowy. Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, I'm pleased to appear before you to testify in support of the President's International Affairs budget for fiscal year 2004. Funding requested for 2004 for the Department of State, USAID, and other foreign affairs agencies is $28.5 billion. I have given you a great deal of detail on this request in my formal written statement, and let me just highlight a few of those items. Mr. Chairman, the President's budget will allow the United States to target security and economic assistance to sustain key countries supporting us in the war on terrorism and helping us to stem the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. It will allow us to launch the Millennium Challenge account, a new partnership generating support to countries that rule justly, invest in their people, and encourage economic freedom. It will allow us to strengthen the United States in global commitment to fighting HIV/AIDS and alleviating humanitarian hardships. allow us to combat illegal drugs in the Andean region of South America, as well as bolster democracy in one of that region's most important countries, Colombia. And finally, it will allow us to reinforce America's world-class diplomatic force, focusing on the people, places, and tools needed to promote our foreign policies around the world. I'm particularly proud of that last goal, ladies and gentlemen, because for the past 2 years I have concentrated on each of my jobs: primary foreign policy advisor to the President and Chief Executive and Chief Operating Officer of the State Department. And under that CEO hat, we are asking for $8.5 billion. And let me just touch on that request for a moment or two, because I think it really is vitally important to the success of our efforts. First, we have been reinforcing our diplomatic troops for the last 2 years, and will continue to do so in 2004. We'll hire 399 more professionals to help the President carry out the nation's foreign policy. This hiring will bring us to 1,100 plus new foreign and civil service officers that we set out to hire 3 years ago to bring the department's personnel back in line with its diplomatic workload. I cannot tell you what a joy it is, Mr. Chairman, to go to one of our swearing-in ceremonies now, because you have approved these numbers over the last 2 years, and see 100 or 150 brand-new FSOs or civil servants, and either Rich Armitage or I swear in every single class, and to see the look in their eyes as they, with pride, they take their oath of office to the Foreign or Civil Service and go forth to places around the world to serve this nation. And not just as cookie pushers, as some might say, but they're going out in the front lines of American diplomacy, out on the offense, putting their lives in danger just as surely as the young men and women in uniform put their lives in danger. We should be very proud of these youngsters. Completion of the hiring program we've put in place will also give us the flexibility to train and educate all of our officers as they should be trained and educated. So I'm proud of what we've been able to do, and I thank you for that. I also promised the Congress that I would bring state-of-the-art communications and management capability to the department. Because if we can't communicate rapidly, if we can't run our business rapidly in this globalizing world, then we won't be able to conduct foreign policy in an effective way. And we're approaching our goal in that regard as well. In both unclassified and classified communications capability, I'm going to make sure that every single man and woman in the Department of State anywhere in the world has access to the internet, access to instantaneous communications, and the $157 million budget request will put us there. Finally, with respect to my CEO role, I just wanted to sweep the slate clean and completely revamp the way we construct our embassies and other overseas buildings, as well as the way we secure them in order to secure the men and women who occupy those buildings. This last task is a long-term, almost never-ending one, particularly in this time of heightened terrorist activities. But we are well on our way to implementing both the construction and the security tasks in a better way, in a less expensive way, and in a much more efficient way. I need your continued support for the $1.5 billion for embassy security and construction and the $646 million in DNCP funding for worldwide security upgrades. And now, Mr. Chairman, let me turn to that part of the budget request for which this subcommittee has primary oversight responsibility. The 2004 budget proposes several initiatives to advance U.S. national security interests and preserve American leadership. The 2004 Foreign Operations budget that funds programs for the Department of State, USAID, and other foreign affairs agencies is $18.8 billion. Our number one priority is to fight and win the global war on terrorism. The budget furthers this goal by providing economic, military, and democracy assistance to key foreign partners and allies, including $4.7 billion that have joined us for countries that have joined us in the war on terrorism. Of this amount, the President's budget provides $657 million for Afghanistan, $460 million for Jordan, $395 million for Pakistan, $255 million for Turkey, $136 million for Indonesia, and $87 million for the Philippines. In Afghanistan, the funding will be used to fulfill our commitment to rebuild Afghanistan's road network. In addition, it will help establish security through a national military and national police force. And our assistance will establish broad-based and accountable governance through democratic institutions and an active civil society. Moreover, these funds will ensure a peace dividend for the Afghan people through economic reconstruction and provide humanitarian assistance to sustain returning refugees and displaced persons. People often talk about how things are going in Afghanistan. Is it going well? Is it not going well? Or what? But when you look at what we've accomplished in less than a year and a half, it's quite remarkable. We've put in place a new government that is representative of its people. We've put in place a system where people are selecting their own leaders. Women are returning to the business place, the workplace, the educational system. It is a tremendous success story. The economy is slowly starting to get started again. Nations around the world are assisting us in this effort. And one of the key indicators of whether or not the glass is half full or the glass is half empty, 2 million Afghans have returned home. In the last year and a half, 2 million souls have crossed the borders from Pakistan back to Afghanistan and Iran back to Afghanistan because they see hope, they see a future, they see what the United States, with its coalition partners, have done with the new Afghan authority to make a promising future, build a promising future for the people of Afghanistan. And no critic can take away from the simple fact that 2 million people have voted with their feet to return to this country that they had fled from over the last 15 or 20 years. I also want to emphasize our efforts to decrease the threats posed by terrorist groups, rogue states, and other non-state actors with regards to weapons of mass destruction and related technology. To achieve this goal, we must strengthen partnerships with countries that share our views in dealing with the threat of terrorism and resolving regional conflicts. The 2004 budget request supports the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Fund, increases funding for overseas export controls and border security, and supports additional funding for science centers and biochem redirection programs. Funding increases requested for these programs will help us prevent weapons of mass destruction from falling into the hands of terrorist groups or various other states by preventing their movement across borders and by destroying or safeguarding known quantities of weapons or source material. The budget also promotes international peace and prosperity by launching the most innovative approach to U.S. foreign assistance in more than 40 years. The new Millennium Challenge account, which has already been mentioned, an independent government corporation funded at $1.3 billion, will redefine development aid, and I'll talk more about that in a moment or two. The budget also provides more than $1.3 billion to combat the global HIV/AIDS epidemic. The President's total budget for HIV/AIDS is over $2 billion, which includes the first year's funding for the new emergency plan for HIV/AIDS relief announced by the President in a State of the Union address, and these funds will target 14 of the hardest-hit countries in Africa and the Caribbean. The budget also includes $500 million for Colombia. This funding will support Colombian President Uribe's unified campaign against terrorists and the drug trade that fuels this terrorist activity. The aim is to secure democracy, extend security, and restore economic prosperity to Colombia and prevent the narco-terrorists from spreading instability to the broader Andean region. To accomplish this goal requires more than simply funding for Colombia. Therefore, our total Andean counter-drug initiative is $731 million for Colombia and for other nations in the region. And critical components of this effort will include resumption of the air bridge denial program, stepped-up eradication and alternative development efforts, and technical assistance to strengthen Colombia's police and judicial institutions. Mr. Chairman, to advance America's interest around the world, we need the dollars in the President's budget for 2004. We need the dollars under both of my hats, Foreign Policy Principal Advisor to the President and CEO, COO of the Department of State. Mr. Chairman, before turning myself over to your questioning, let me touch on a few of the points that have been raised in the course of the opening remarks. With respect to the concerns that you raised, Mr. Chairman, about some of the new initiatives, let me say that first, with respect to the contingency fund, the complex contingency fund, the fund is currently being set up to allow us to respond to those crises that come along in the course of a year. It's funded at $100 million. These problems that come along in the course of the year where we need funds on an immediate basis. Someone will come into me and say, Mr. Secretary, something just happened in a particular country. A crisis has broken out somewhere. There is an immediate need for funding. And rather than going around constantly robbing Peter to pay Paul or looking for pigeonholes of money that might be available, this will give the President and will give the Secretary of State enormous flexibility to respond without disrupting other efforts and programs. Who is responsible for it? The State Department. Who will answer your questions? The State Department. Obviously, how the money is placed is a question for the administration to work out with the Congress. But who will answer to you as to how it has been used, whether it has been used in accordance with the intent and will of the Congress? It will be the Secretary of State and the State Department. With respect to the Famine Fund, it will be administered by USAID under the foreign policy direction of the State Department and the Secretary of State. And who is answerable to the committee on the use of these funds? It will be USAID and the State Department. With respect to the emergency plan for AIDS relief, there will be various federal agencies under the direction of a new AIDS coordinator who will work directly for the Secretary of State. So on this initiative as well, it is the State Department and the Secretary of State who will hire this individual, supervise this individual. Obviously, there will be other departments of government, and there will be obvious interest from the White House. But I can assure you there is always that interest in every account that I have, as there should be. I am not a free agent running freely through the woods. My responsibility is to make sure that I am following the President's priorities, and I would expect that the White House would work closely with the State Department, and I would work closely with them as we use these monies. But who is answerable to committee and who you should come to if floggings are appropriate, it is the Secretary of State and the Department of State. And I will carry out those responsibilities in the manner I try to carry out all the responsibilities that I have. With respect to the general question of are we undercutting USAID when we create new programs such as a Millennium Challenge account or the emergency fund for HIV/AIDS. I don't think we are. I think what we're trying to do is find new and innovative ways to deliver services. And I have the greatest respect for USAID, and I work very closely with its distinguished administrator, Andrew Natsios, and all the other terrific people that are in AID. Andrew is at my staff meeting every single morning. I am with AID every single morning at 8:30, and we are doing everything we can, building on Andrew's initiatives to make AID more responsive, to do a better job of using the resources that have been made available to them, to fight as best we can to get them increases in their budget, and less the new initiatives, HIV/AIDS and the Millennium Challenge account, we have been able to provide some additional increase for AID programs this year. Not as much as I would like, but it is an increase. Because what AID does is extremely valuable, and it is in no way, at least in my mind, in conflict or is competing with the Millennium Challenge account or with the emergency fund for HIV/AIDS. It's just that we're looking for new ways of delivering assistance. So to dismiss it as sort of a corporate approach, and therefore it is somehow fatally flawed because it is a corporate approach, I don't think is quite the right characterization of the Millennium Challenge account. The President wanted it to be a separate independent corporation because he wanted it to be seen as something new and different, something that will focus on those nations, those developing nations that have made a firm commitment to democracy, to transparency, to the rule of law, to economic freedom, to empowering men and women, and are prepared now to make investments in the infrastructure that then can make these countries more competitive in a globalizing world. That's the purpose of the Millennium Challenge account. And it will help other AID programs that might be underway in those countries as well. But we wanted to show a different face to the manner in which we provide support to countries. Similarly, and as you know, Mrs. Lowy and others, the independent corporation is under a board of directors consisting of the Secretary of State, the Director of OMB, and the Secretary of the Treasury, and it is the Secretary of State who will be the chairman of that board and will be providing direct oversight and supervision to the independent corporation. But as an independent corporation, it is also directly answerable to the Congress, as well as answerable in reporting to the President through the board which I chair. A lot of this will come up in questioning, so I won't belabor it, but one final point, if I may, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Lowy, you made reference to constant public declarations dissing our allies in the United Nations. The President took this problem to the United Nations, and he sought a solution from the United Nations. He did that last September in a very powerful speech, and that powerful speech resulted 7 weeks later in a powerful resolution that was endorsed by every single member of the Security Council at that time, 15-0, Resolution 1441. Now, there has been enormous debate since then, because some of the members of the Security Council who signed on at that time didn't understand that the United States of America was deadly serious. We were going to disarm Saddam Hussein peacefully, or if not peacefully, through the use of force of arms. And in the months that have passed, we have seen 4 more months of continued violation, continued ignoring of the past obligations and current obligations that Saddam Hussein has. Some members of the Security Council would like to say, just keep inspections going, just wait and see what he will do, put the burden on the inspectors. The burden is not on the inspectors, the burden is on Saddam Hussein. And what 1441 required was for him to comply and cooperate fully. He's not complied, he's not cooperated fully. And we believe the case is clear. There are some members of the Council who will veto any resolution that comes along that might require that Saddam Hussein comply or face the use of force. And so we have found that there is a great deal of now disagreement over this issue, and I'm not unmindful of the public disagreement that exists in Europe and elsewhere. But there is also a great deal of support. The United States is not isolated politically on this issue, and nobody is supporting us. I can point to the strong efforts of Prime Minister Blair of the United Kingdom. I can point to the speech that Prime Minister Howard of Australia gave yesterday to the people of Australia. I just left a meeting in the Oval Office with the Prime Minister of Ireland, a small company that stood up strongly on the Security Council last fall and voted with us and continues to support us. Even though they have difficulties at home, they know what has to be done to disarm this nation. I can point to Bulgaria, Italy, Spain, the Vilnius 10, the Group of 8, Japan. The United States is not in this alone. If one thing is clear, the whole world recognizes that Saddam Hussein must be disarmed. The debate we're having, the disagreement we're having, is how best to accomplish that. We have tried to accomplish it peacefully for 12 long years. Saddam Hussein is the one who is guilty. Saddam Hussein is the one who is not responding. It is he who is not complying. The only reason he's doing anything now is as a result of the threat of force. I remember when the President gave his speech on the 12th of September, within 3 days, suddenly, Saddam Hussein was starting to say, let the inspectors in, but not really. Everything he has done since the President's speech has been an effort to try to keep away the day of reckoning. Well, the day of reckoning is fast approaching. We still hope for a peaceful solution. We hope a peaceful diplomatic way can be found. But the one thing that we have made clear to the world since the very beginning of this crisis is that the United States is committed to the disarmament of the Iraqi regime. We hope it will be done peacefully, but if it's not done peacefully, the United States is prepared to lead a coalition of the willing that will do it. And when it is done, there will be bills, as mentioned here this morning. There will be need for reconstruction. But in that effort, the Iraqi people will be better off. The United States has a track record of over the past 60 years of leaving places a lot better than we found them. Mr. Chairman, in the interest of time, I'll stop there because I think we'll repeat a lot of this in questioning.
I suspect a good deal of this will come up again in questions. Chairman Young.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and Secretary Powell, thank you for joining with us this morning. I'm going to start with a specific question, but it's going to open up a topic. The issue of aid to Turkey, a longtime ally and a longtime friend and a very strong supporter any time that we needed them. We're talking about a $6 billion package for Turkey. At least that's the conversation that we've heard. But in the '04 request, there's only $253 million for Turkey. Where do we get the $6 billion from?
This was going to have to be another request placed before the Congress, and it was not in the budget because it simply was not something that had been developed at the time of the budget submission. But clearly, through supplemental action or other action, the funds would be found. Right now, because of political difficulties that the Turkish government has had, even though they want to support us and took it to their parliament, they were unable to get the support that we need at this time. At the moment, that package is not before us. It's not on the table.
Speaker Hastert and I met with the Turkish delegation when they were here, and they visited with you and visited with President Bush. And our commitment to them was that whatever the president agreed to do for them, that we would make sure that that commitment was met. And that is our commitment. And I'm wondering whether, let me just get you to speculate a little bit. Would we see a budget amendment for the '04 budget, or would we see a supplemental request along with '03 supplemental for Turkey? And I think there will be others that will follow along with additional demands.
Yeah, Mr. Young, I'm afraid I can't answer that because I mean it's not just what Turkey might need. There are other countries that have to be considered, and there are other departments beside mine that would have to be considered. So I would have to yield to my colleagues in OMB and the West Wing as to how they would bring forward these requests in the form of budget amendments, supplemental, or things of that nature.
Well, I know some of the other countries that you're thinking about because most of them have been to see us also.
And me.
So looking for a substantial increased request here. And, we'll deal with that. The real world is the real world, and you're doing a really good job in trying to manage that real world. And sometimes it's like trying to hold Jell-O in your hand, I know that, but you've done a very good job at representing the President Bush and representing our national interest. But the reason I started with Turkey, I wanted to get into the subject of the supplemental. I'm getting considerable pressure from a lot of agencies now saying, hey, when are you going to get us a supplemental? And my response to them is, as soon as I get a request from the administration, I will move a supplemental through the committee quickly because I understand the importance of it, especially to the Department of Defense and the effort that has already taken place in building up in preparation for war, if that's necessary. Do you have any time constraints? Are you in a hurry for a supplemental, or does it make any difference?
Mr. Young, I'm always in a hurry for a supplemental, but lots of things, of course, have to be considered, and I really must yield to my good colleague Mitch Daniels, who I don't let him negotiate in the UN, and he doesn't let me play with supplementals.
Okay. A lot of commitments are going to have to be made. We're the big kid on the block, and we have a lot of responsibility in the world, a lot of obligation, and I know that we're taking on additional obligations. You just mentioned there will be a lot of bills and reconstruction.
Can I make one point
Sure,
on reconstruction?
please.
There will be requirements. The one thing that makes Iraq, should it come to a conflict, somewhat different than, say, Afghanistan, is that this is a country that will have a rather significant revenue stream.
Sure.
I mean, they should be able to receive $20 billion a year in revenue as a result of oil sales once the situation stabilizes, and they can take care, to a large extent, of their own reconstruction and needs.
No, and I understand that, and the situation I know is very much different than it was with Iraq back in '91 when you and the then Secretary Cheney, we did such a tremendous job in Desert Storm. But I think my question is, because we were presented a budget yesterday in our conference that non-defense discretionary spending is going to be reduced rather than have increases, which occasionally happen because of inflation. And fortunately, there's not much inflation. But we're going to be faced with a really tight non-defense discretionary budget. So I'm wondering how much consultation that there will be between the administration and the Congress in the amount of commitments that we actually make before sending the bills up here.
Well, I can speak for my department, Mr. Young, and we will consult fully, and I think we do a pretty good job of consulting with the appropriate committees and staff directors and others who have an interest. That's the case for State Department, and I think I can speak for my other cabinet colleagues as well, that we understand the importance of sharing with the Congress what our requirements and needs are going to be as best we can determine them. Some of it is simply hard to know right now. The actual needs in Iraq, if that comes to pass, are really a function of how the operation goes and what one finds when you finally get in there, and what the immediate humanitarian needs are. How fast can you reestablish the flow of funds out of the Oil for Food program escrow accounts, and how fast you can get a revenue stream going? Has there been damage done to the oil facilities that would cut off the revenue stream for some period of time? So a lot of it is really hard to know at this point, and the best you can do is make some estimates of it, and I know that's what the administration is working on.
And we understand that. Mr. Chairman, let me have just one more minute here. I read your statement, Mr. Secretary, on the assassination of Prime Minister Gingrich. And I know that you knew him well and had spent considerable time with him. I had known him before he was elected and had discussed with him numerous issues, not only with Serbia, the Milosevic thing, but my concern with Montenegro, because he had become a very stabilizing factor when the Đukanović government was out barreling down toward an independence vote. Gingrich brought some stability and I think calmed the issue down there. What do you see happening in the Balkans now, especially with Serbia, Montenegro, with this tragedy of the assassination of what I think was a good reformer, a leader?
Thank you, Mr. Young, for bringing it up, because it allows me once again to, in this more public setting, express my condolences to Serbs for the loss of this rather unique individual. I got to know him well. He sat in my office many times over the last 2 years, and we've been on the phone many times over the last 2 years as I went through certification issues with him that you all know well, and turning over of criminals and how he managed the Milosevic period aftermath. And he was as committed a public servant to his people and to his nation as I've ever known, and his loss will be felt deeply. And as soon as this hearing is over, I'll be going over to their embassy to sign the condolence book on behalf of the United States. And I spoke to the foreign minister yesterday, but we are entering a fragile period. They've had to take some emergency steps right now to stabilize the situation and to go after the assassins and the organizations, the criminal organizations these assassins belong to. My staff is hard at work now, working with our friends in Europe to stand ready to help Serbia in any way we can as they try to regroup and put in place a government that can deal with this fragile situation. So I don't know where it's going to lead, but I think a new element of fragility and vulnerability has been put back into a region where we thought we were getting on top of it, and we're watching it very closely.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the generous allocation of time.
Mr. Young, you always have that allocation of this subcommittee. I am, however, going to be very strict, since we have every member here except one right now, on the 5-minute rule, and starting with myself here. In fact, I'm going to only ask one question. I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to at least get one round. I know the Secretary has to leave no later than 1 o'clock here. I want to return, Mr. Secretary, in my question to the issue I raised, and you did address it at least broadly, generally, and that is the division of labor within foreign operations budget. It seems that both presidents and Congress, so I include both of us in this, appear equally attracted to having new foreign policy objectives and broad strategies, but sometimes we're not so good on the implementation and the oversight of them. And I think we're facing some really fundamental management decisions regarding the core competencies of the various agencies that are responsible for making grants and loans in support of American foreign policy. And I addressed that in my remarks, talking about the MCA account, the new famine account. And so I hope, though you said the State Department is in charge, I accept that. The State Department is in charge, or you said State Department and USAID. But I'd like to get a little bit below the surface of that to a little bit more of to the extent that you can, help us with how are we going to manage the implementation of the new HIV/AIDS initiative? How is this new coordinating office going to integrate it with the previous presidential AIDS initiatives, such as the Global Fund, which was a creation of this administration, basically, the Mother-to-Child HIV Prevention Program, and then just to put them all together here, same with the MCA, the Millennium Challenge Corporation. How would we expect the role of USAID in that to evolve over time? And finally, with the new fund for complex emergencies and the famine relief, what additional capabilities are these new tools going to add to the management of the similar 150 accounts that already exist? I'm really not clear on that last one, so there's all three of those all together.
Yeah. With respect to the HIV AIDS initiative that the President launched in the State of the Union address, it'll be the organizational setup is still being studied, but it will be within the department, and I'm going to be creating it, special coordinator reporting to me, and answerable to the President. And the exact structure I'm still examining with my staff. It is important. It's going to have quite a bit of money to work with. And so I want to make sure that we put in place a solid organization that will get oversight of it. We are still examining how best to do this, Mr. Chairman, and so my answers are necessarily general because Rich Armitage and Grant Greenmine, the Secretary.
Just following up on that, is the money for, like this new coordinating council, which we understand is going to have maybe it's 100 employees, is that in the budget request?
What, sir?
Is the money for the staff for this in the budget request to implement?
I'll have to find that for the record, but if not, it will be in the next budget request. But I don't know if we've actually programmed for it. I don't even know how large the office will be, but there will be a requirement for additional personnel.
I guess my question is, if it's the programs are in the 2004 budget, is the implementation of it, the staff to handle that in the 2004 budget?
I don't think it is in there in any specificity, but since the funds are in there, I think the funds, to some extent, will be available to at least set up the organizational structure for it. Any program needs an organizational structure. But at the time that the budget went in, we did not yet have the details of organization. Is it a bureau? Is it an office? How many people will it require? How should it report directly in a way that shows that I have direct supervision over it? All of those issues I'm trying to work out now, and we are working them out now.
How about, before my time runs out,
Yeah.
the last one about how does the new complex emergencies and famine relief add to the tools that you've got now to manage those kinds of problems?
I don't know that I can add much more to what I said earlier, in that we often find ourselves with these unfinanced requirements that I can't meet out of existing funds, and a contingency account, which I think is a solid, sound management practice, should be available to a Secretary of State or to my Deputy Secretary to deal with these kinds of crises as they come along. I don't think it's a terribly complicated concept, and I think it'll be just like any other account that we manage on a regular basis. With respect to the famine fund, it was set up by OMB in the White House in a manner that allowed us to have some degree of flexibility as to how it would be used. So AID and state, and of course the White House, would have an opportunity to see and have oversight of this account. But I'd like to provide an answer for the record on the specifics of how the famine fund will be managed.
Thank you. Ms. Lowy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, the British are working on an altered UN resolution which sets up four broad categories for Iraqi compliance. First of all, can you clarify for us what the U.S. position is on the British proposal? What forms the basis of the March 21st deadline for meeting these standards? Does the U.S. agree that the British proposal now under consideration would form a basis for determining Iraqi compliance on disarming? 2, will the UN Security Council vote at all if we expect to lose? If a supermajority vote of 9 members of the Council were to be achieved, what would the next steps be, and who will judge Iraqi compliance? And do you anticipate another report to the Security Council from the UN inspectors? And how much past March 21st are we willing to wait? And lastly, what specifically does Iraq have to do to demonstrate compliance with these demands? Sorry to give you all at once, but I know the votes are going to go off any minute.
Well, and I'll try to be
Thank
very
you.
brief. The resolution that is before the council is a resolution that the British put down last Friday with co-sponsorship from the United States and Spain. We put down that resolution as a way to give those nations who wanted to see whether there was one last chance for Iraq to comply, something that they could support. And it was pretty straightforward. Unless this council has decided by the 17th, at the time we put it down last week, that Iraq has met the kinds of tests that have been out there for Iraq to meet all along, then they've lost their last chance. Over the past several days, the British, in an effort to even be more specific as to what Iraq can do to get out of the box that they have put themselves in, came up with this list of 6 tests as a way to see whether more nations could find this a way forward. And we watched and helped the Brits with this effort. We are in a period of consultation on the 6 tests. Not all of us have bought all of the various elements of the 6 test language, but we're certainly working closely with the British, with the Spanish, and many others. And so the British put it down yesterday as a way to be helpful, to see if there was a way to move forward. Instantly, one member of the council, one of the permanent members, dismissed it out of hand and said they'll veto anyway. They're going to veto anything, any language, anything that comes along, they said they will veto. And then shortly thereafter, Iraq rejected it. So Iraq isn't looking for a solution. They know the tests. The tests have been out there forever. When Dr. Blix put down his unresolved key task last Friday, it was once again an inventory, a list of all the things and all the questions that Iraq has not responded to, has not answered over the years. And so this was a British effort to go one last step. And unfortunately, one member of the council with veto authority dismissed it out of hand, joined shortly thereafter by Iraq that dismissed it out of hand. And the final point is, we are still talking to the members of the council to see what is possible with respect to coalescing around a position that wouldn't draw a veto, but the option remains to go for a vote and see what members say, or not go for a vote. But all the options that you can imagine are before us, and we'll be examining them today, tomorrow, and into the weekend.
So at this point, you haven't decided whether you will go for a vote if you have less than what is needed?
We are working hard to see if we can take this to a vote. That would be a vote that would help unify the council. But we haven't excluded any of the other obvious options that are out there.
I guess I have about a half a something or other? Okay. With regard to Iraq reconstruction, while the committee staff has been briefed on initial planning for post-war Iraq, Congress does remain largely in the dark about the planning. No one is apparently willing to address what it will cost. We read about the $20 billion in the news. Can you tell me, and Chairman Young briefly referred to that, how much it will ultimately cost? Do you have any earthly idea? And will we be briefed, or will we be kept in the dark?
I think increasingly the briefings are coming forward. We've done a heck of a lot of work over the last several weeks in determining what will be needed once we get in there under a certain set of assumptions. And I think through public briefings, as you saw from the Pentagon earlier this week, the office that's running this, as well as briefings of Congress, that will become clearer, and it's not our effort to keep you in the dark. Some of it is unknowable, but I cannot give you an estimate of cost, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
We have two votes underway. We're going to go until 6 minutes, later than 6 minutes left remaining in the two votes, in the first of the two votes, and then we will stop. And quickly, as soon as the second vote is cast, we will come back and resume. Because they don't give us extra time as they used to on the floor, we have to stop right at 6 minutes. I may interrupt you right in mid-sentence, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Nolenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Secretary Powell. I wanted to commend you and the administration for initiating and funding the MEPI. That's the Middle East Partnership Initiative, because I do believe it's something that this committee should embrace. Everything right now seems to be viewed through the lens of Iraq. But whatever happens to Iraq, the challenge is still going to be there. And I think post-Iraq provides us an opportunity. I want to just very quickly quote something that I think is very telling, and I believe this was something that was a part of your speech. 50 million more Arab young people will enter the already crowded job market over the next 8 years. But economies are not creating enough jobs. Growth is weak. The GDP, and this is important, GDP of 260 million Arabs is already less than that of 40 million Spaniards, and falling even further behind. And if you add in the 67 million in Iran, the total is still only about 2/3 of Italy's. I know how important this work is to you. I know Mr. Armitage, Deputy Secretary Armitage, is involved in this as well, and you're going to be reviewing a lot of these programs. But here's one that I believe is important, and I think it reflects this publication, which started the whole thing. And I think within this book is plenty of information for us to look at it. What I'd like to know from you, in your view, how important is this issue of demographics and jobs? And I've heard it said that, in fact, I just had a quote here too, that it's the men, it's the people, it's the men, women, children who are the real wealth and hope for the Arab countries. So my question is it possible that these human resources can turn out to be an asset for Arab economies? What role does the U.S. play in this issue? And then how has this program been accepted by the Arab governments? Has anybody said no? And how can the U.S. pursue this program with a positive message?
Mr. Nolenberg, thank you for your support of MEPI. I think it is a key program because it goes right to the heart of the problem you described. And the document you held up was written by Arab thinkers and intellectuals and officials, not by the United States government. What it says is we've got to get our act together. We have got a young population. We've got a young population that has got to be educated, trained for the jobs that are going to be there in the 21st century. They've got to get the kind of quality education that will contribute to their economies. Their economies are not growing. 260 million Arabs should not have a GDP that is so far below that of, say, just one country, Spain. And so I think more and more Arab leaders are coming to the realization that there has to be a transformation in their countries. Each will have to do it in their own way. We're not asking them all to do it the Jeffersonian American way, but each of them have to understand, and I think they are understanding more and more with each passing day as they look at those kinds of statistics, that they have to start changing. MEPI, Middle East Partnership Initiative, is a way to help them through education of teachers, through fixing their educational systems. The response we've gotten has been mixed. Some people are suspicious of change. How dare the United States come in here and try to help us in this way? Others quietly say, come on in. And others have been outspoken in saying, come in and help us. So it's mixed. I think once we get this Iraq situation behind us one way or the other, it'll be a far more favorable climate for this kind of initiative.
Okay. Well, I do appreciate that, and I think that you're reviewing all the assistance programs now, as I understand it.
Yes, sir.
And this one is one I think that, as I've mentioned, is one that you'll be looking at very closely to augment whatever else you're doing. So I do think that this is on the right track. And again, I would appeal to the chairman to consider, I know my sand is running down, but I think that if people will on this committee, will look at this program, I think they're going to get an understanding of what the dilemma is and what we may be able to do about it. And again, I salute
Thank you, Mr.
your
Nolenberg.
leadership. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have 7 minutes. I think in the interest of time, rather than start another round, we'd better go and vote. And the moment I get back, whoever's here, if Mrs. Kilpatrick is next, but if she's here, we'll call on her, and whoever otherwise is here, we'll call on to get started with the next round.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Subcommittee will stand in recess.
We say, Jerry.
Tape it down. Would that get it closer to him? So you don't sacrifice your shotgun. Whatever you think works best.
I mean, I've got the shotgun level with the other one.
Okay.
He's not touching it.
Yeah.
Touching it.
With everything works better.
The subcommittee will resume, and we'll go to Ms. Kilpatrick for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, always good to see you, and thank you for your courageous leadership as we do what we do.
Thank you,
Thank you very much. I want to first start with my 5 minutes with the new initiatives. The Millennium Account Corporation. It's my understanding it'll be a quasi-public corporation, government-sponsored, $1.3 billion, with the board of directors being secretaries. You'll be the lead on that, and that the chief executive officer, I'm assuming, will be someone other than a secretary.
Yes.
Has that person been a type of person rather than name? What you're looking for, what their salary would be? Have we gotten that far with what that would be?
I think we have gotten that far, although I can't tell you specifically what the salary would be, but we're looking at candidates now. We're looking at people who are proven leaders, who have a record of managing fairly complex and large organizations, and who are committed to the principles that are embedded in the Millennium Challenge account approach. And so we are looking for somebody, but it will not be anybody from government. It might be somebody who's had government experience, but we're looking for a private individual to come in and run what is an independent corporation.
And where would that person who believes they have qualifications for such a venture apply or contact, or what is that process?
I'm looking at candidates. The White House is looking at candidates. It'll be a collective search, just as it is for most of our presidential level appointments.
And what would be the relationship with USAID? I've heard all the questions, and I don't want to reiterate those that have already been asked as it relates to that, yes, something new and challenging is always good. What I don't want to see, and I'm a little bit concerned, I don't want it to be political. One thing about the civil service system, and the director and a couple appointees are, and I respect Mr. Nassio on his work, and the others who have come before them, it's an agency of civil servants who don't have any personal political. I'm concerned that this new one, with $1.3 billion of taxpayers' dollars, will be too partisan, will be political appointments that it's a new venture and may become too partisan. Should I be worried at all?
Well, I think any organization of government at that level should reflect the philosophy of the president at that time, and that's why we are all called political appointees, and I don't think that's necessarily a derogatory term. It should not at the same time be overly partisan to the extent that it shuts out all points of view and it only goes down one track. We have tried to design the Millennium Challenge account system in a way that the countries that will get funding from the Millennium Challenge account will have met certain objective criteria.
Which I outlined. I did go over those just briefly. And that's what you mean, your 16-point plan that you'll be using to assess whether the countries can qualify or not, right?
There'll have to be some, but we don't want to make it so objective that it's like just a SAT score. There has to be a certain level of poverty, a clear commitment to democracy, and it has to meet these criteria, but we also want to leave sufficient judgment in there, not to make rash partisan political calls.
We hope it can't be that.
Yeah.
I mean, the world, and if it's going to do its mission, as I understand it, though it's a political appointment, and usually the secretaries are from various persuasions, I want to make sure that that doesn't happen, that we defeat before we start. That's going to be very important.
I could also make the case, if I may, ma'am, that I have seen situations in my career of senior government service over the last 15, 20 years, and being an observer at a lower level for many years before that, where even funds that are supposed to be totally, you're supposed to be totally objective in the distribution, have been used to serve foreign policy objectives, and some might say partisan objectives.
Yeah, I'm not saying it can't be done. It definitely can be done. I want you as the leader of this new agency, as it comes together, and the president to know that we all want it to be a bipartisan initiative. That if it's going to help, it has to be bipartisan.
Yes, ma'am.
With the criteria set up right now today, if it were instituted, would South Africa meet the qualifications?
I want to provide an answer for the record. My initial reaction would be probably not.
Would Uganda?
I can't start going down country by country.
No, I wouldn't
but
do
it's let me say this about South Africa and Uganda, however. Without having in my head the GDP and per capita income and all the other statistics, what both of them are trying to do is put in place the kind of system, the kind of, resting on a rule of law and trust and openness. If they are meeting those criteria, then they've met that first test. Then we'll see about other tests with respect to, are they more needy than other countries with respect to their GDP and their health and educational needs, and can they absorb the funds? Can they do it? And can they use these funds in an efficient way?
Right. Mr. Secretary, you know that in most third world countries that are developing, from whatever stage they are, the need for education, let's take education for example, is paramount and devastating and very, very low level in many of the countries, both on the Asian and African continent. I'm concerned that what we've set up, we may be leaving out some of the poorest of the poor countries who may not meet this millennium criteria, but just in fact needs the assistance that USAID and others, and I would hope the Millennium Account is able to give them.
Well, USAID is always there, and
But it's with less funding with this new Millennium Challenge.
It has as much funding as it had before, but we've had long discussions about this, because one of the real challenges here is if you have a country that is very, very poor, and the people are desperately in need of funds, and they may be getting those funds from AID, but if we're not confident in the government, if we're not confident that the rule of law is in place, then we're not sure we want to invest in a country where the money might not be effectively used,
Totally
even
agree.
if they are the poorest of the poor.
I totally agree. I see my sand's gone. I totally agree with that. Just 1 second, Mr. Chairman. If we are not confident, I want that to be subjective rather than objective. I want it to be objective rather than subjective. The confidence that this new Millennium Board has and uses, that it be objective and not subjective.
It is, we are trying to design a system that is objective, but not to the point of allowing no subjective judgment to be used.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Yeah, and not dissembling, we could take a parallel with college admissions. There are some.
He's cutting me off. We're going to do a one-on-one.
Okay.
I'll
Let me just say to the gentlelady that we are going to be holding an entire hearing on the MCA in May.
Very good.
And Mr. Secretary, you could be helpful to us when we have that, if you could help us get some of the people who normally don't testify before this committee, who help design the program, the criteria and so forth, that from the administration to come up and be willing to testify, because otherwise it will be a not as fruitful a hearing as it might otherwise be.
Got it,
I would
Mr.
appreciate
Thank you, Mr.
that.
Secretary.
Mr. Wicker.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Secretary. Thank you for being with us again and for your patience with our questions. I'd like to discuss Colombia with you, particularly the outrageous kidnapping last month of 3 United States civilians, along with the deplorable execution of 2 human beings, one a United States citizen and one Colombian citizen, after their plane crashed in the jungles of Caqueta. I understand they were the captives are being held by the FARC. I also understand that the caps on U.S. military personnel set at a level of 400 by this subcommittee had to be exceeded for the search and rescue operations, and the law allows you to do that. Could you give us an update on the search and rescue mission for these 3 captive Americans?
Yes, sir, and I appreciate that the cap did permit us to, the law did permit us to exceed the cap for this kind of contingency, an unfortunate contingency of looking for 3 Americans who have been kidnapped by the FARC. We are working very closely with the Colombian government. We're trying to provide all the assistance that we can. They, of course, are in the lead. It's their country, and they know more about this area than we do. But unfortunately, I cannot give you any progress report today. We don't know where they are. We don't know exactly which group of the FARC is holding them, and so we have not made a great deal of progress in securing their release yet.
You know for a fact that some subgroup of the FARC is responsible.
It is my best information that the FARC are the captors.
Well, how will this kidnapping change U.S. policy toward Colombia and our anti-drug efforts there? Could you comment on that?
It will not. It's sad that it happened, but it is a risk that we must run in order to try to defeat these terrorists and these narco traffickers and to help President Uribe. I visited Colombia not too long ago and had a long day's worth of meetings with President Uribe and all of his other cabinet officials, and I am impressed by his total commitment to ridding Colombia of narco-terrorists and narco-traffickers and all the others who are trying to destroy Colombian democracy. And Colombia has paid a price as a result of his commitment. They've seen a number of bombings recently. Many lives have been lost. But President Uribe is determined and committed, and we owe him our full support.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Let me shift then briefly to the topic of information dissemination worldwide, and mention to you specifically the fact that when we began to feed Afghans, many of them gave the food to animals at first because they didn't have confidence that the food they were receiving would be safe for them. This is going to be a long-term process of winning the hearts and minds and overcoming the embedded hatred that begins at the very earliest ages among people worldwide. Could you comment on that, and how can we ever tackle this huge problem of overcoming the anti-American sentiment, which is unjustified, certainly?
I think you have to separate this into parts. We are seeing a lot on the world stage now that could be characterized as anti-Americanism. When you probe deeply into it, though, you find out that very often it's anti a particular American policy at a particular point in time. And when you get past that policy issue, whether it's Iraq or the Middle East, you still find solid appreciation of America, solid understanding of what America is all about, and there is residual support for America. So it's, I believe, more policy-driven than it is some innate hatred of America and all things American. If I believed it was America and all things American, then I would close all of our consular officers, which are busy issuing visas with long lines of people lined up in all of these countries that are so-called so anti-American, to come here, to go to our schools, to go to our entertainment centers, to go to our healthcare facilities. And when you look at the vibrant Muslim community that exists in the United States, it still shows that we are looked upon with favor. Go to any community you wish to in Washington, and you will see people who have come from throughout the world and all of these hotbeds, so-called, of anti-Americanism to become part of America and to share with their families back home, and for some of them to gain an education or to get their health care or to earn some money and go back to their homelands. I think, therefore, that this is a problem that we have to work on constantly and not just be put off by the current crisis, whether it's Iraq or the Middle East. In our public diplomacy efforts, led so ably by Undersecretary Charlotte Beers, who unfortunately will have to be leaving because of a health problem, I constantly said to her and the other members of the team, just don't worry about the current problem. Build for the future. Start putting out a message of our value system, not as a value system to be imposed on others, but a value system that is there to be looked at and see whether it applies to others. Let others make that judgment. But don't get so wrapped up in the crisis that we are not helping people to understand America in the long term and for the long haul. And I think that when Iraq is dealt with, and when people see how committed the president is to finding a solution in the Middle East, and if we can find a solution in the Middle East or see progress anyway toward that solution, some of this anti-Americanism will fade away, and you will see that there is still a residual understanding and respect for America. It is also one of the consequences of being the most powerful nation on earth. There's an element of resentment in that. So while there is admiration, you will also find on the other side of that coin resentment for the position that we occupy in the world. we could end anti-Americanism, as it is sometimes described, by simply coming home and not paying any attention to anyone. You don't like us, we'll just come home. We'll stick between the Atlantic and the Pacific, the left coast and the right coast, and we won't play a leadership role in the world. We won't mix it up in the UN. We won't go to foreign countries and use our young men and women to bring freedom to an Afghanistan or to Kuwait, even because we're going to be unappreciated. But that's not what the world expects from us. So we'll have to play our role in the world and hope that if we do play that role well and accomplish the tasks that are out there to be accomplished, people will understand.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and let us
Sorry,
know
Mr.
how this subcommittee can be helpful to you. in that
Thank you,
regard.
Mr. Wickham.
Thank you, Mr. Rothman. Mr. Rothman? Yep. Yes, Mr. Rothman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, it's always a pleasure to see you and have you here come before us. I want to talk first about Iran. There are reports in the press that Iran has introduced uranium hexafluoride into some centrifuges to test their functionality. If this is in fact true, would this be a violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and what would be the course of action for the United States? And regardless of whether that report is true or not, what is your view as to the present danger to the region and America's interests now presented by Iran, not only in its nuclear program, but also in its active support of Hezbollah in Lebanon, for example?
With respect to the specific question about the hexafluoride, we are deeply concerned about some new information that has been found out about Iran's nuclear programs, and we're waiting to see the final judgment made by Dr. Blix and the IAEA. And I spoke to Dr. Albarade and the IAEA, got my inspectors mixed up briefly. I spoke to Dr. Albarade about it last Friday and look forward to a definitive statement. But the United States has been saying for some time that we are deeply concerned about Iran's efforts to not only have nuclear power, but to use that nuclear power infrastructure to develop the capability to produce nuclear weapons. We've raised this issue repeatedly. We've talked about the axis of evil and been criticized for it. And lo and behold, we discover they had a far more robust nuclear infrastructure that could be used for weapons development than people had thought or wanted us to believe. We were seen as suspicious and we shouldn't be moving in this direction, but now we have a real concern. When you marry that up with their continued support for terrorist organizations that foment terror in Lebanon and other places throughout the Middle East, I believe that our concerns with respect to Iran were well-founded, and the President's willingness to point this out directly in the course of his 2+ years of leadership have been proven correct.
Well, I applaud the President for identifying Iran as one of the members of the axis of evil. I just want to get a better handle on what the administration is doing about it. And, for example, what steps the administration is taking, for example, to support what I believe are the vast majority of Iranian citizens who would no longer wish to be oppressed by the handful of religious fanatics now ruling that country, despite the fact that the people twice now have chosen overwhelmingly reform candidates.
With respect to the nuclear programs, we have been in close touch with IAEA and with Russia and other providers of this kind of technology and infrastructure to the Iranian government. With respect to the basic issue that you raised, though, the young people of Iran, especially the young people of Iran, but all the people of Iran, they believe a better life is ahead of them if they could somehow get their leaders to understand this. And right now you have a battle taking place between the forces of the political leadership under Mr. Khatami and the religious leadership under Mr. Khamenei. And we continue to put out a message to the Iranian young people and to the Iranian people that the United States supports them in their efforts.
Mr. Secretary, just one last question, a two-parter. Has the United States made it clear to the Iranian government what we would be prepared to do should Iran take further steps to create nuclear missiles? to create nuclear bombs and then the vehicles to deliver them. And the other part of the question has to do with Syria and how the administration believes Syria is complying with the Taif agreement, and whether you are optimistic about the continual withdrawal of Syrian forces from Lebanon that apparently went from 20,000 down to 16,000. Can you envision the day when the Syrian occupiers will leave Lebanon to the people of Lebanon?
With respect to, have we given the Iranians some ultimatum of some kind, or what we would do if they continued moving down this road? No. But we made it clear to the Iranians and to those who support Iranian nuclear efforts and missile developments that we find this to be irresponsible action on their part. And the Iranians know what our views are with respect to these sorts of efforts without us giving a specific, as we never would, telling them exactly what options we might take if we found ourselves threatened. With respect to Syria, I hope it is the beginning of a longer drawdown that would go to nothing, but I can't be optimistic about that. We were pleased to note that there has been a reduction of the kind you suggested, but I've seen ups and downs in the number of Syrian troops in Lebanon on and off over the years. So I cannot tell you whether this is on a path to get down to zero and let Lebanon be ruled by the Lebanese people without the presence of an occupation army.
But that is our objective. That's our national
It's been
policy.
our objective, yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Ruthven. Mr. Kirk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I wonder if you feel the diplomatic dance is so tiresome that you long back for your old job running the Fifth Corps.
The good old days.
Yes, right. Regarding North Korea, as you know, the government of Japan owns more plutonium than anyone else. And people have said that Japan could become a nuclear power in a long weekend, have a much larger arsenal than China could possibly have. Should this happen, other nations in the region would also considering acquiring nuclear weapons, even Taiwan. Given such a scenario that Japan would have to look at a rising, possibly irresponsible nuclear threat from North Korea and her national security options, it would seem to me that the government of China would be very, very interested in not having other Asian nations take the nuclear option. Have we discussed this scenario with the Chinese at all?
Extensively. President Bush and President Jiang Zemin discussed it at Crawford, the President's Ranch, last fall. And you may recall after that meeting, President Jiang Zemin reaffirmed that the Chinese policy is a denuclearized Korean peninsula. I have discussed it regularly with my foreign minister colleague, Mr. Tang. And in fact, because we've been meeting at the UN in New York every week for the last several weeks, we have had at least, and I was in Beijing 2 weeks ago, we discussed this at least 5 times in the last 2 months. The Chinese are very concerned about this issue, sensitive to this issue, and I'm working very closely with the Chinese to see if we cannot find a way forward to bring this matter under control and convince the North Koreans that a better future awaits them without nuclear weapons than one which awaits them with nuclear weapons.
Now, in 1994, we signed the agreed framework when North Korea said that they were pulling out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We promised them free oil and free nuclear reactors in return for a commitment not to produce fissile material. I believe in 1998, the U.S. government learned that North Korea was violating that agreement, but that was closely held. And then Assistant Secretary Kelly, during his visit last year, got an admission from the North Koreans that they were producing fissile material. You have wisely reviewed our agreed framework commitments, but continued food assistance to North Korea. It's my understanding that North Korea is the largest food aid recipient of the United States, that the United States feeds every child in North Korea under the age of 15. Can you talk about your continuing aid commitment to North Korea that you have made?
Yes, sir. With respect to the first part of your statement, though, you're quite correct. When the agreed framework was signed in 1994, it was yet another agreement that North Korea made not to have nuclear capability. They had signed a couple of years earlier a North-South agreement with South Korea, not to have nuclear weapons in the peninsula. And they made many other commitments over the years. The previous administration succeeded in capping that particular program at Yongbyon. And I've always given credit to my colleagues in the Clinton administration for having done that. What they didn't know and what we didn't know for the first year and a half of this administration is that the North Koreans had pocketed that, and we're now doing it a different way through enriched uranium. And that's what Jim Kelly called to their attention. They admitted it. So the agreed framework capped something, but did not cap everything, and also left in place material, the plutonium facility, that could be uncapped at some point in the future. And now the North Koreans got caught out in the other program, and they're uncapping Program 1, and their demand on us, okay, come talk to us again, because we know how this negotiation goes. You'll pay us something to cap all of this stuff again. Well, we're not going to quite do that. We believe this is now a problem for the region, for the very reason you mentioned, sir, and that is it should be a concern to Japan and to South Korea and to Russia and to China and to the rest of the world, and not just a bilateral U.S.-North Korean problem. With respect to food, it's always been the United States policy that a child in need is a child in need, whether it's in a democracy or in a dictatorship. And our policy this year is to try to meet our obligations to the World Food Program, call for food for North Korea, and we have committed 40,000 metric tons of food in a first tranche, and we are considering up to 100,000 tons. But we do have concerns. We're not absolutely sure that we are feeding all of the children, that all of the food is going to people who are truly needy, or is it going somewhere into the system to feed their army and to feed their elite? So the first 40,000 tons we have given over, but we are anxious to see whether we can make any improvements in the system by which the food is monitored, so we know where it is going. Is it truly going to people in need?
Thank you for that. One last question. Am I out of time? Or very briefly.
Very briefly.
We will have a Middle East peace conference, I would expect, after any conflict is resolved. I'm just concerned that the point of the conference not be adjusting Israel's borders, which I think probably leads to some sort of de facto division of Jerusalem, but instead is talking about the lack of democracy in the Middle East. Because I think if we had democratic countries, they would represent much less of a threat to the other democracies in the region, being Turkey and Israel. And I just lay that out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
As is the normal courtesy, we always go to the chairman and the ranking member when they are here, and so I would call on Mr. Obey unless you want.
No, let's let everybody else go first.
All right, Ms. Kaptur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Mr. Secretary, welcome, and let me thank you for the respect. Let me thank you for who you are and the respect that you have earned among the American people, this Congress, and indeed the people of the world. And the questions that I have relate to the difference between the words occupation and liberation, and I'll build on those. Throughout modern history, no Western power has been ultimately successful in occupying nations in the Muslim world. France, from the time of Bonaparte through World War II, was not successful in Egypt nor in Algeria. If we think about the British in Saudi Arabia, I think Lawrence went home. If we think about Iran and the U.S. support even of the Shah, including CIA support for the Savak, ultimately the Shah was deposed internally and a theocratic regime took hold. And finally, Russia met its Waterloo in Afghanistan, and we are not out of Afghanistan yet. My first question, and I'll do all three questions and then let you just respond, and thank you for that. How does the administration propose to conduct this Iraq occupation so as not to become a regional enemy in our attempts to liberate that nation? And my second question builds on that is the motivations of the terrorists. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the number 3 operative for al-Qaeda that was apprehended in Pakistan, was born in the nation of Kuwait. He attended a Karachi Mosque, noted for its radical teachings, and there are thousands of such mosques throughout the Muslim world. When you appeared before the UN in February this year, you stated that Abu Musab Zarqawi, a Palestinian from Jordan, was the al-Qaeda operative inside of Iraq. And we all know that the majority of hijackers on September 11th were Saudi, from inside Saudi Arabia. Now, we know there are over 5,000 madrasas that are luring young boys and teaching a twisted version of the Quran throughout that region. And in Palestinian camps in several countries, we have over 1 million individuals living in abysmal conditions, which are spawning grounds for terrorists. How can we win a war on terrorism when fervent recruits to the cause are being recruited every day far beyond the borders of Iraq? And finally, because your budget submission does not include it, Saddam Hussein has nationalized the oil fields in Iraq, and there is no submission in your budget to pay for the war, nor what will follow. Is it the administration's intent to provide for an ownership structure and
To do what, ma'am?
an ownership structure for those oil fields and some type of transactions that would occur that would ultimately pay for the engagement that we are involved in now?
On the third question of the oil fields and the oil belongs to the Iraqi people under international law and the moral obligation I think we have. It will be our policy that a system will be put in place where that oil would be made available to the world market, and the revenues would be used to sustain and support the Iraqi people. The humanitarian efforts that we might conduct and other reconstruction activities that we might perform would certainly seem to be for the Iraqi people and would be consistent with the use of that revenue flow. The military action that we're taking and any recovery of costs for our military action, at least my judgment, and I believe the judgment of my colleagues in the administration, paying for that directly out of those funds would not be consistent with our obligations under international law. We have an obligation to protect the assets of the nation for the nation, use those assets for the nation, and that would be my answer to the first question. With respect to occupation versus liberation, the examples you gave were not only occupation, they were colonization. We don't go to create colonies or obtain colonies. To characterize it as an occupation, I think, would be inaccurate. Obviously, if there's a military operation, there has to be a period where the military that has gone in and removed the previous regime has an obligation to protect the people, to stabilize the situation, and to immediately begin the transition to some other form of authority within the country. We would immediately be seeking international support for the effort if we don't start with international support, which is, of course, our hope. And that international support would include UN resolutions that would give us access to funds of the Iraqi people that can then be used for the Iraqi people. And so we would internationalize it quickly, not try to make it an American colony or leave in place an occupation army for some indefinite period of time. We would try quickly to pass off responsibility to civilian administrators. We would very quickly begin to put in place Iraqis who would begin to exert political influence and then ultimately political control as we transition the whole thing to responsible Iraqi leadership. We would not destroy the country so that the whole place had to be reconstructed, nor would we rip apart every single ministry in the country. There are Iraqis who are waiting there to put in place, help put in place, we believe, a responsible new form of government. These people have been oppressed by a dictator for years. Some of them are part and parcel of the dictatorship, but there are others who I think would like to see a new form of government that would use the wealth of the country to benefit the country, not develop weapons of mass destruction to threaten neighbors. And I think we can do this in a way that will provide an example to the rest of the region that the United States comes as liberators, not as occupiers, not as colonialists, And that example, I think, would help with the second point you made with respect to removing some of the motivation for terrorist activity. There are still madrasas all over. And the kinds of programs that we talked about earlier in the Middle East Partnership Initiative and trying to persuade our friends in the Arab region that they've got to do something about transforming their societies and transforming their economic systems to start training these youngsters not in madrasas for violent futures, but to train them for the skills and to train them for the jobs that they're going to have to create in order to develop 21st century economies. And this is a challenge that we can help our Arab friends meet.
We have 3 more people. We're going to try to get them all in before the Secretary has to leave here. Mr. Crenshaw.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for all your service. A couple of quick questions. One, kind of back to Colombia a little bit. I think up till September 11th, our involvement was more in the counter-narcotics. A lot of people didn't want to go too far, and I think we saw after September 11th that terrorism is terrorism, and we're a target, whether it's narco-terrorism or terrorism. And I'm encouraged to see the administration take a more engaging role in helping train Colombians in terms of anti-terrorism. But from time to time, I'll hear complaints in terms of intelligence sharing. I want to ask you about that. Are we working together with them? And more importantly, are we training them in terms of intelligence gathering to kind of teach them as opposed to just doing it for them? Could you comment on those?
I think we are doing a much better job on intelligence sharing and giving them the capability to generate their own intelligence. When we realized after 9/11 that a terrorist is a terrorist is a terrorist, and we came to the Congress and asked for permission to start removing some of those barriers that existed between counter-narcotics work and counter-terrorist work, and got that permission. We've been able to do quite a bit more, and I saw evidence of this when I was there earlier this year, a few months ago, of close cooperation with our embassy team and the Colombians, and with specialized organizations of the United States government and their parallel organizations in Colombia.
Thank you. And one last question about Iraq. Obviously, Saddam is a threat to the world, a threat to the Middle East, but other than Kuwait, the neighborhood is relatively quiet in terms of military action. And I wonder what your take on that silence is of the countries there in the Middle East that are obviously threatened certainly as much as the rest of the world.
We are getting quite a bit of cooperation from almost every country in the region. Sometimes it's silently. Some nations are able to speak out more openly about the level of cooperation. But I believe they do see the danger, and there isn't any one of them who comes here and says, gee, he's a great guy. He's not bothering us. Quite the contrary. They will all breathe a sigh of relief when his weapons of mass destruction are under control, and an even deeper sigh of relief if he went out there.
Thank you, sir. You may.
Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, last week, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld was interviewed by the BBC. The interviewer asked Secretary Rumsfeld if he thought that the U.S. position regarding Iraq would have more credibility and if the U.S. would win more backing from the rest of the world. And I quote, he said, "You'd spent a fraction of the time on the Israeli-Palestinian problem as you've spent on Iraq." Secretary Rumsfeld replied, and again I quote, "Well, probably." He went on to talk about the efforts the administration has made, including the president's speeches, your own efforts, and other envoys, etc. And with all of this, he agreed that, and I quote, "Had there been success there would have been possibly greater support." Mr. Secretary, it seems to me that out of everyone in this administration, you probably better than anyone else understand how important U.S. credibility on the Israeli-Palestinian track is to U.S. credibility on other issues in the Middle East, including Iraq. So as someone who understands this so well, could you please tell this committee how this administration plans to build some credibility on this issue now and as we get ready, I assume, to attack Iraq, and after the U.S. undertakes what will be an entirely new and obviously a complicated role on the ground and as a player on the ground in the Middle East?
I certainly agree with Don Rumsfeld that if we had been able to achieve greater progress in the Middle East with respect to the crisis between the Israelis and the Palestinians, it would improve our overall situation in that part of the world and around the world, and it would garner greater support with respect to whatever efforts we may have to take with respect to Iraq. We've worked very hard on this. I've been engaged in it since the first week of my service as Secretary of State. I've been through the Mitchell Plan, the Tenet Plan, sent General Zinni over. We have given statements and speeches. I gave a Louisville speech. The President has been deeply engaged. The President has given major addresses on this, and he gave a definitive address before the United Nations, where as the first President of the United States to do so, he called for the creation of a Palestinian state with the name of Palestine. He said to the UN, living side by side in peace with Israel. His 24 June speech of last year, which is a combination of his views, but also incorporating the views of Crown Prince Abdullah of Saudi Arabia and many other Arab leaders, the Arab League, once again communicated that vision of two states living side by side in peace. So we have worked very hard, but we have not been anywhere near as successful as I would have hoped or imagined at the very beginning. Principal problem has been the continuing violence and terrorism that has come from the Palestinian side directed against the State of Israel. In response, the State of Israel has not been able to do some of the things that I would have liked to see Israel do to move the process along. Nevertheless, we are engaged, deeply engaged. We worked with the quartet, the United States, Russian Federation, the European Union, and the United Nations to come up with approaches to the problem. We're developing a work plan which is near completion in terms of its actual drafting, and we're looking for the right time to put it into play, to release it. We have made it clear to the Palestinian side that they needed to bring up new leadership because the old leadership was not getting the violence under control and was not coming forward with initiatives or ideas that would help us build a dialogue with Israel. In the last several months, we've seen a new Israeli election. Prime Minister Sharon is back in office. His cabinet is now in place. And in the last week, we have seen the emergence of a gentleman who is going to be the next, or the first, however you want to characterize, the Prime Minister of Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian people, in the person of Abu Mazen. And so we have a new dynamic in play. And I hope that new dynamic of a Prime Minister with authority, real authority, will allow us to move forward. But it's through no lack of engagement. But Don Rumsfeld was quite correct when he said if we could have improvement in this area, it would help us throughout the region.
Mr. Secretary, the President has been talking a lot about democracy, about how bringing down Saddam Hussein will lead to a wave of democratic reform throughout the Middle East. And I want to be clear, we all believe in democracy, and we all believe that individuals everywhere, be they in the United States, Europe, Africa, Latin America, or the Middle East, deserve democracy. They deserve to be represented by leaders who have been chosen through free and fair elections. They deserve all the rights and freedoms that we as Americans have fought for and continue to fight for. In an op-ed published Monday in the LA Times, Professor Shibli Telhami of the Brookings Institute argued that whatever the intent, a war with Iraq is likely to perpetuate repression in the Middle East, not spread democracy, at least in the short term, will be the goal. The pattern is clear. As we pursue policies that are highly unpopular in the Middle East, we ask, indeed insist, that governments support these policies. To accomplish this, those governments unleash their security forces to prevent dissent, to contain public demonstrations, to limit freedom of speech, to disrupt any potential organization from undermining their stability. In the case of war with Iraq, the regimes fear that passions could be inflamed if there are many civilian casualties, so they plan ahead with particular ruthlessness. My question, Mr. Secretary, is not whether democracy is a worthy goal, but rather whether this administration has taken into consideration the possibility that war in Iraq could not only fail to bring about democracy to the region, but could undermine the growing democratic movements in places like Jordan, Lebanon, Iran, and even the Palestinian Authority and perpetuate repression throughout the region. I'm very concerned that the administration is taking it as an article of faith that whatever changes this war wreaks upon the region, of course the potential of war, the result will be an improvement in the present situation. And I've got to tell you, Mr. Secretary, that seems like a very risky assumption. I welcome your comments and your reassurances.
If a dictator is removed from Iraq, and if this country of 24 million skilled people with a significant revenue flow turns away from threatening and invading its neighbors and becomes in its place a place of stability that is not threatening its neighbors and is using its oil for useful purposes, it seems to me that helps the region overall. Nothing we are doing, it seems to me, undercuts any of the liberalizing or democratic movements that are taking place in countries such as Jordan or Bahrain or Qatar or Kuwait. We have seen changes in these countries, and you take note of this, Mr. Jackson. We have seen changes take place in these countries in recent years, where their legislatures are starting to function, where women are being allowed to participate more fully in civic society. It's a mixed picture, country by country. But we have seen some movement, and I see no reason why suddenly having a nation that is not threatening the world and threatening a neighbor and causing the kind of crisis it is now, not there any longer under that leadership, would not be anything but a stabilizing influence. And also, I think, with that out of the way, it gives us the opportunity to work more fully on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And so I don't find the thesis in that article necessarily the correct thesis. We will continue to encourage all of these nations to start moving in a road toward democracy. Not that it is a panacea, but when we look at the kinds of problems discussed here earlier with respect to young people not being educated for the 21st century, with denial of opportunity to 50% of populations because they're women, this is not going to be a way into the future. And I think we're making that case repeatedly with all of our friends, to include those that you might characterize as the least democratic. But I'm telling you, we are making that case to them and telling them, you have to figure out your transformation, how you're going to do it in the future. We are not going to do Iraq so that we can come and impose democracy on you. It's going to have to grow up. It's going to have to come out of your experience.
The Secretary has to leave in 5 minutes, so Mr. Over gets the last question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I have a profound respect for you. And one thing I've always appreciated about you is that I didn't think you approached life as though you were viewing everything through the prism of being a permanent president of an optimist club. You have I think, a more balanced view of the world. And I also do not detect in you the same kind of arrogance that is so often associated with so many people in this town. But I want to just express and I'm not going to ask you an Iraqi question. I mean, the Iraq issue has become almost theological, so I'd like to talk about something else. Three things, really. First of all, did you know Shlomo Argov? He was the Israeli ambassador to London, who was turned into a paralytic by Abu Nidal's group in a terrorist attack almost 20 years ago, and he spent the last 20 years as a paralytic, and he's just died. He was, in my view, a tremendous public servant, and he's just an example of what happens to good people in a region where it seems that we're running out of wise men before we run out of fools. But I'm concerned about the hiatus in American deep involvement in the Middle East. I agreed with the administration in sort of laying off the peace process for a while after you came into the White House, because I thought that Mr. Arafat needed a cold shower after he threw away the chance for peace in the region. But I have considerable disquiet about how long that that lack of deep involvement has occurred. And I appreciate what you said to Mr. Jackson today, but I would still urge, especially in the context of what apparently is going to happen in Iraq, I would still urge that we elevate very, very quickly our focus on the renewal of the peace process, especially after you have a new opportunity with Abu Mazen, as you indicate, apparently becoming the new prime minister. I just believe it is foolhardy for us to be doing something to the Arab world if at the same time we are not doing something for them and for the Israelis at the same time. Because as you know, there is never any progress in the Middle East unless we are deeply involved. And I just think we're making a profound mistake in not being more aggressive in seeking out contacts with people other than Arafat, if that's what you want, but just to make clear that we're not just going to abandon the Middle East to the violence that's seen on Al Jazeera television every night in their own biased way. Secondly, I would say that I am tremendously disturbed by our lack of immediate focus on and direct contact with North Korea. I respect the administration's, I respect the fact it's a terrible problem, but I really believe that, it almost appears to me that the administration is acquiescing in North Korea's becoming a permanent member of the nuclear club. I know they already are a member, but I'm not convinced that if we draw the line just at their ability or their willingness to sell, that we're ever going to be able to tie that down tightly enough to be in our own interest. And then thirdly, I just have one question, which I think that you may not want to answer or may not be able to answer, but nonetheless I have to ask the question. The Washington Post this morning carried a story. The FBI probes fake evidence of Iraqi nuclear plans. The FBI is looking into the forgery of a key piece of evidence linking Iraq to a nuclear weapons program, including the possibility that a foreign government is using a deception campaign to foster support for military action against Iraq. I feel that I need to ask, do you know or can you tell us what that country is?
I can't with confidence. It was information that was made available to the inspectors, didn't come from the United States. Came from other sources, and at the time, and it was provided by, I don't even think the United States provided it, but we were aware of this piece of evidence, and it was provided in good faith to the inspectors, and our agency received it in good faith, not participating, if that's a suggestion of your question, in any way in any falsification activities.
Well, I'm certain that you would not in any way be involved in anything like that. But I do think it's important that the Congress and the people of the United States know, if it is in fact the case, that they know which country supplied that and whether or not they supplied it knowing that it was false information or whether something else happened.
Yeah, I can't answer that, Mr. Dobie. I'd have to yield to others.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Robey. And Mr. Secretary, I know I speak on behalf of all the members that were frustrated not to be able to get to a second round of questions. And we know how busy your schedule is, and we do appreciate very much your taking the time to be with us today. And I know I also speak for all the members in saying how much, no matter where we are on some of these issues, how much we admire your dedication and your service to our country and the job that you're doing. And we very much appreciate your coming and testifying today and answering the questions as forthrightly and candidly as you have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me conclude by once again thanking the members present for all the support that you have given to the State Department over the last 2+ years. It means a lot, not to just me, but to the wonderful young men and women out doing their job doing that great job for the American people. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. The subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you so much.
The United Nations Security Council held a closed-door meeting today to discuss a new British proposal on Iraq. Afterwards, several of the ambassadors spoke to reporters, including representatives from Russia, Britain, France, and the U.S. This is a little over